Imagine this. A 19th century philosopher leaves a social gathering, leaving behind whispers of surprise and condemnation. Friedrich Nietzsche did not do so out of rudeness, as many might have thought. His departure was dictated by the conviction that every minute spent on idle talk takes away a piece of true life. As early as 1879, he wrote to a friend of his disgust at empty exchanges where people's mouths move, but their souls remain silent. More than 140 years later, humanity continues to spend an average of 2.5 hours a week on small talk, talking about the weather, weekend plans, and other minor details that fill everyday life. Such discussions would undoubtedly have caused N to leave not one, but a string of dinner parties. But here's the curious thing. Modern psychology is beginning to confirm the philosopher's point. Studies show that people with developed emotional intelligence and cognitive complexity often avoid superficial socializing. They are not driven by antisociality, but by a desire for deeper and more meaningful interactions. Think back to the last time you felt a surge of energy after socializing rather than devastated. This feeling may be the key to understanding what makes socializing truly valuable. It's unlikely that a moment of genuine intimacy occurred after discussing the upcoming weekend or sympathizing about a rough start to the work week. More likely, it came after a conversation that made you think, challenged established assumptions, and revealed something genuine about the person you're talking to. The paradox is that the modern understanding of socialization often prevents deep human connection. In an era when loneliness has reached epidemic proportions, it may be worth rethinking the wisdom of a 19th century philosopher. The path to meaningful relationships is not through superficial conversations, but through the courage to dive deep into the human soul. Before dismissing this idea as outdated and irrelevant to contemporary realities, it is worth noting that many prominent leaders and innovators of our time avoid small talk. They have realized what Nietzsche knew. Time is too precious to waste on conversations that do not stimulate intellectual growth or lead to personal change. In the summer of 1869, Nietzsche expressed his growing contempt for society's accepted norms of polite conversation in a letter to his sister Elizabeth. This letter was a revelation of his views on the superficiality of small talk. The author of these words firmly stated that he had no inclination to artfully constructed lies passed off as social niceties. When anyone inquired about his well-being, he expected to hear a truthful answer, whatever it might be. And this was not merely a manifestation of a philosophical stance. During his time in the academic circles of Basel, N drew attention to an important feature of human communication. The more often he attended obligatory social events, the more he became convinced that these polite conversations did not strengthen, but rather weakened human ties. In his personal notes, he noted how intellectually advanced people try to conform to the generally accepted norms of social communication. The irony of 19th century salon culture did not escape his attention. These gatherings, which were supposed to facilitate the exchange of ideas, had become hotbeds of what he called the great emptiness. Conversations had become so devoid of meaning that they actually prevented genuine human contact. One day, after a particularly tedious evening, he remarked to a friend that humanity had invented many ways to avoid meaningful conversations. Such reflections are surprisingly reflected in the realities of today. Meetings on the sidelines of offices, informal gatherings, and social networking often exhibit the same patterns criticized by the philosopher. Research shows that the modern professional spends up to 40% of his or her working time on what scholars call empty speech acts, i.e., conversations that have no constructive purpose other than to maintain the appearance of social activity. Yet the cognitive costs of these kinds of interactions are quite tangible. According to research conducted at the University of California, participation in superficial conversations activates processes in the brain similar to stress reactions, comparable to mild social anxiety. At the same time, deeper and more meaningful conversations stimulate the areas of the brain responsible for feelings of satisfaction and pleasure, the same areas that are activated by eating delicious food or experiencing genuine joy. N's criticism was not limited to mere dissatisfaction. He saw in such small talk the manifestation of a deeper cultural malaise, namely the fear of genuine human intimacy. The author notes the paradoxical tendency of people to endless lip service rather than risk sincere self-disclosure. This observation, like an ominous omen, is reflected in the modern era, where technological progress has provided countless opportunities to maintain constant communication while paradoxically avoiding genuine human contact. The price society pays for this model of superficial communication has not only philosophical, but also quite tangible consequences. Modern workplace research demonstrates that teams that practice deep and meaningful communication exhibit 34% higher productivity than those who limit themselves to formal and superficial exchanges of information. This raises a legitimate question. Should we not move beyond small talk, but rather how to do so? The philosopher proposes an alternative that represents nothing less than a revolution in the realm of human interaction. His personal correspondence, intimate diary entries, and philosophical treatises reveal an individual who developed a radically new approach to human relationships, an approach that is only now beginning to find understanding among contemporary psychologists. His relationship with Richard Wagner provides a vivid illustration of this approach. According to H's journal entries, their acquaintance began with a lengthy 4-hour discussion on Schopenhauer's concept of the will. Without prior courtesies or social conventions, they immediately plunged into the depths of philosophical analysis. Wagner later remarked that he had never before met a man who could penetrate so quickly into the essence of any question. During his teaching career in Basel, N became famous for his unconventional social habits. He often invited students on so-called thought walks in the picturesque Swiss countryside. These were not just spontaneous walks, but carefully planned conversations aimed at overcoming social stereotypes. One of his former students recalled, "He asked questions that challenged all established assumptions. It was exhausting, exciting, and at the same time seemed more real than any other conversation I had ever had to have." His relationship with El Salome serves as another prime example of this approach. Their conversations, often lasting days, covered a wide range of topics, from the essence of love to the question of the death of God. Eyewitnesses to these discussions noted their extraordinary intensity, which seemed to attract and disturb at the same time. Lou Salome later recalled Nietzsche's almost sinister ability to turn each discussion into a profound exploration of the human soul. Perhaps most telling, however, is Nietzsche's relationship with his sister Elizabeth. In their correspondence, the philosopher repeatedly urged her to abandon what he called the great emptiness of social conventions. He wrote that every time a person speaks without expressing his true thoughts, he loses a part of himself. Nietzsche urged that it was better to risk offense than to hide forever behind a mask of politeness. This was not just a philosophical gesture. Nietzsche developed specific methods for achieving deeper interactions between people. He believed that genuine conversation should begin with what he called dangerous questions. Questions that challenge not only opinions, but also a person's fundamental beliefs. The philosopher argued that true friendship can only emerge through intellectual confrontation, through the voluntary disclosure of one's deepest thoughts and doubts. Yet the figure of N does not appear as an ardent opponent of social goods. His later works reveal a subtle awareness of the moment when it is necessary to plunge into the depths, and when it is necessary to comply with generally accepted norms. For him, small talk is not an absolute evil, but rather a dangerous comfort zone that people rarely leave. The key, he believes, is developing the wisdom to recognize the moment to break through these superficial patterns. His personal social circle, though small, was characterized by an extraordinary depth of connections. Those who were close to him recalled conversations that radically changed their view of the world. One friend remarked, "Communicating with N carried the risk of changing everything. It was frightening and liberating at the same time." This alternative approach to human interaction was not simply about improving the quality of conversations, but about using dialogue as a tool for mutual development and transformation. In an era when genuine connection is becoming increasingly rare, N's method offers not only a critique of small talk, but a real path to something more meaningful. The aversion to lightweight conversation is not new to our time, nor to Friedrich Nietzsche, as historical facts and cultural examples attest. Symposia in ancient Greece were not just drinking parties, but venues for serious discussion. Plato's writings indicate that at these meetings it was forbidden to talk about the weather, work, and other insignificant things. Instead, participants were to immerse themselves in philosophical reflections on given topics, such as the nature of love and the meaning of justice. Similar customs were observed in medieval monasteries. The Desert Fathers, the first Christian monks, practiced so-called spiritual conversations, which were specifically designed to avoid formality and discuss deeper spiritual and philosophical issues. Their writings show that their approach was very similar to that of Nietzsche. One monk wrote that it is better to remain silent than to speak words that do not change the soul. The Renaissance saw the emergence of a salon culture that at first adhered to these depth-oriented traditions. In brilliant 16th century Italy, Florentine assemblies, patronized by the powerful Medici family, were renowned for their high intellectual level and the depth of the issues discussed. Nevertheless, by the time of Niccolò Machiavelli, these assemblies had unfortunately degenerated to a great extent, turning into the likes of theaters of politeness, as the thinker contemptuously called them. They were the same superficial social gatherings that disgusted him by their lack of authenticity. This historical example highlights an important tendency inherent in human communities. Often starting from a sincere devotion to deep and meaningful dialogue, they gradually slip into banality and frivolity. The French salons of the 18th century, originally conceived as centers of philosophical and political debate, over time acquired a reputation as places where gossip, intrigue, and the pursuit of social elevation prevailed. This transformation was so comprehensive that by the 19th century the ability to engage in casual conversation was considered a sign of high social status and elite membership. Interestingly, cross-cultural studies reveal curious deviations from this model. Japanese culture, for example, has traditionally valued the art of meaningful silence in conversation. These pauses are not seen as awkward interruptions, but as a valuable space for reflection and deep understanding, allowing participants to reflect on what has been said and prepare a thoughtful response. In Finnish society, there is an ingrained belief that silence is more powerful than idle talk. This is evidenced by the folk wisdom that says, "Knowledgeable people do not talk for nothing, and those who talk a lot usually know little." In Bedouin culture, traditional coffee gatherings, known as kaha, have always been a place for the exchange of wisdom stories and poetry rather than superficial chatter. These meetings, which sometimes lasted for hours, required participants to make deep, meaningful statements rather than simply exchanging meaningless phrases. These historical and cultural examples support Nietzsche's point that his criticism of small talk is not simply a personal opinion, but rather an observation of a general trend in the development of human society. With the development of civilization and the rise of politeness, there is often a loss of the depth that characterized earlier forms of communication. Thus, Nietzsche's call for a return to meaningful dialogue can be seen not as a radical innovation, but as an attempt to reclaim what humanity has repeatedly created and lost throughout its history. In today's corporate realities, whether in office spaces, conference rooms, or virtual meetings on Zoom, Nietzsche's critique of superficial small talk takes on a special relevance. The average office worker spends about 3 hours a week on what management experts have aptly dubbed empty communication rituals. But industry giants such as Microsoft and Google are actively experimenting with new approaches to communication that resonate with Nietzsche's philosophy. At Microsoft's Redmond campus, teams have introduced the practice of deep work conversations, structured dialogues designed to replace traditional small talk. One product manager noted an impressive 40% increase in team satisfaction after standard morning roll calls were replaced with more meaningful exchanges. Instead of the usual questions about the past weekend, team leaders now initiate discussions by asking thought-provoking questions, such as, What has recently challenged your usual way of thinking? Silicon Valley startups are also at the forefront of this change, pioneering so-called philosophical stand-up meetings. Instead of routine progress reports, these meetings open with a provocative question or challenge. One technology firm found that initiating meetings with queries such as, "What is our belief about the product that might be wrong?" stimulated innovative solutions that standard idea generation methods could not identify. Remote working suddenly opened new horizons for more meaningful conversations. In the absence of spontaneous office meetings that often devolve into idle chatter, organizations have been forced to purposefully orchestrate their online communications. Spotify's digital workspace structure includes in-depth channels where employees are encouraged to share their concerns, challenges, and intellectual tasks, rather than simply informing them of the current status of projects. Professional networking is also undergoing a transformation. Classic networking events, with their forced small talk and business card exchanges, are giving way to what one entrepreneur calls idea salons. In today's world, there is a shift away from superficial networking in favor of deeper and more meaningful discussions. Various gatherings and events now intentionally set specific topics for discussion, avoiding trivial questions like, "What do you do?" Participants are encouraged to share their most controversial professional views or discuss pressing industry issues. Even social media, often criticized for being superficial, is emerging as a platform for deep conversations. For example, groups on LinkedIn dedicated to philosophizing about business strategies are showing significantly higher engagement rates than traditional networking networks. On Twitter, spaces where users question conventional wisdom are gaining popularity, attracting thousands of participants. The dating sphere is also undergoing change. Apps like Hinge are introducing features that encourage users to connect more deeply from the start. Statistics show that couples who begin their communication by discussing values and beliefs have a better chance of building a long-term relationship than those who limit themselves to casual banter and superficial conversations. In the digital age, interpersonal relationships are taking on new horizons to reinforce their depth and significance. Friendship circles are actively using specialized apps designed to encourage discussion of important issues during meetings, thereby enriching communication. Family meals are being transformed by the introduction of conversation menus that guide participants to deeper and more meaningful exchanges. Even traditional holiday events, often reduced to superficial small talk, are being reimagined through structured activities aimed at establishing a genuine connection between people. Some progressive companies are going a step further by introducing the position of Chief Communications Officer. These experts focus on improving the quality of dialogue in the work environment, aiming to minimize idle chatter and create the conditions for meaningful exchange of ideas to flourish. Preliminary research shows that teams where meaningful communication patterns predominate exhibit higher rates of innovation and improved ability to solve complex problems. A practical approach to transforming communication from surface conversations to deep dialogue is not to suddenly start philosophical debates at the water cooler, but to gradually develop what one famous philosopher called the art of thoughtful conversation. It requires a conscious effort to create an atmosphere of trust and openness where each participant feels comfortable expressing his or her thoughts and feelings. Based on personal experience and current communication research, a practical transformation of communication emerges. N's personal social circle was built around so-called conversational rituals. When meeting new people, he would often begin with a simple observation, but would quickly move on to deeper topics. For example, a discussion of the weather might evolve into an exploration of human perception of time and change. Modern psychologists call this deepening the frame, a method that allows one to move from the superficial to the essential. In a professional setting, this approach can be particularly effective. Instead of asking a colleague about their weekend, you can ask what they are currently learning or what challenges they are facing. A sales executive who implemented this method noted that client meetings became strategy sessions, resulting in a 30% increase in long-term contracts. Digital communication offers unique opportunities to deepen conversations. Email correspondence is no longer limited to routine project progress reports, but is now becoming a forum for discussing perspectives on workflow improvements and strategic planning. Virtual meetings increasingly begin not with idle chatter, but with analyzing actual problems and finding ways to solve them. In one of the companies in the technology sector, it was noted that the teams that have implemented such a practice demonstrate a higher level of interest and an unconventional approach to problem solving. Even friendly gatherings can become more interesting if they are spiced up with, as one expert put it, reasonable provocation. Instead of the usual conversations about work or the weather, you can toss in some intriguing question or observation for discussion. For example, the question, "What has surprised you the most lately?" often elicits a much more lively response than a casual, "How are you?" Family relationships especially benefit from this approach. Holiday meals, which are often reduced to superficial exchanges of phrases, can be turned into a forum for deep and meaningful conversations. One family shared their experience of building rapport after establishing a tradition of asking each other questions at dinner. In every social circle, there is someone who suggests a topic for everyone to discuss, and this tradition, which began with simple questions, has evolved over time to discuss deeper topics, reflecting the growing level of trust and intimacy between people. Increasingly, groups of friends are hosting a kind of philosophical retreat, where the conversation itself becomes a source of pleasure and intellectual stimulation. Abandoning superficial conversations about television programs or gossip, friends immerse themselves in exploring each other's worldviews, touching on fundamental questions of human existence. An example of this is a group of like-minded people from Seattle who, after incorporating this practice into their lives, found that their friendships became significantly stronger in just 6 months. The key principles behind this transformation include, first, start the conversation with an observation rather than a question, to pick up on something specific about the current moment or shared experience. This creates a genuine foundation for deeper dialogue. Second, follow genuine curiosity. When someone shares their thoughts, it's important to focus on what's truly interesting about their response, rather than being guided by social norms or expectations. And third, embrace productive silence. As N notes, meaningful conversation requires the ability to comfortably tolerate pauses. These moments of silence provide an opportunity for reflection and deeper understanding of what is being heard. The art of conversation goes beyond simply exchanging lines. It involves creating a dynamic in which light topics flow seamlessly into deeper reflections. This approach, which requires patience and practice, gradually reveals new facets of communication. It is not necessary to strive for every conversation to reach philosophical heights. It is important to remember that the goal is not to eliminate casual exchanges, but to develop the ability to go beyond them when appropriate. In the professional realm, structured depth can be particularly beneficial. For example, team meetings can begin with each participant sharing a pressing problem or interesting idea. Interactions with clients can focus on identifying underlying motivations, not just immediate needs. One consulting firm saw a significant strengthening of client relationships after training its staff on how to engage in meaningful dialogue. The key is not to impose depth, but to create an environment conducive to its expression. By developing the ability to have meaningful conversations, we open the door to genuine connections. As thinker H astutely pointed out, the true richness of human relationships grows not from trivial courtesies, but from shared immersion in a world of ideas and life experiences. In this profound wisdom, N realized something fundamental about the nature of human connection that is only now finding confirmation in scientific research. For it is the quality of our conversations that shapes the quality of our being. N's criticism of superficial conversations was by no means the grouchiness of a misanthropic philosopher, but rather an insightful look at undiscovered human potential. Modern scientific research suggests that people engaged in meaningful conversations exhibit higher levels of happiness and overall well-being. In particular, a Harvard study found that participants in deep discussions experience stronger social bonds and greater life satisfaction. Thus, What N intuitively grasped through philosophy is now supported by objective data. N's message takes on a special relevance in our day. In an age of unprecedented technological connectivity, genuine human connection is becoming increasingly scarce. We scroll through endless tapes of superficial interactions on social media, while the thirst for meaningful exchange of thoughts and feelings becomes ever more acute. The philosophical approach to the problem of communication was not to flee from society, but to redefine it. Progress lay not in the complete abandonment of meaningless conversations, but in recognizing them as a springboard rather than an end goal. Behind every superficial exchange of remarks lies the potential for a deeper and more meaningful conversation. Every social interaction offers a chance to step outside the box and dive into authentic communication. As N wrote, "The higher our flight, the less visible we are to those who cannot fly." The audacity to initiate meaningful conversation may initially be perplexing to those around you, but it sets off a chain reaction. One person striving for more than an empty exchange of pleasantries often inspires others to follow suit. The challenge, therefore, is not only to recognize the pointlessness of endless small talk, but also to actively pursue something more. The ability to ask deep questions, to hear the unspoken, and to create an atmosphere in which genuine dialogue can flourish. In this approach, there is not just a homage to Nietzsche's philosophies, but also a return to an appreciation of the importance of human interaction, the ability to turn ordinary encounters into episodes of genuine understanding, and the ability to see social contact as a stimulus for self-improvement, and to create relationships that are satisfying and energizing instead of depleting. For those who seek deeper insights into philosophical concepts that can transform daily life, a subscription to the channel is suggested. Future plans include exploring how the wisdom of the ancients can be applied to the pressing issues of today, providing practical tips for enriching lives and building meaningful connections.